Hey everyone, welcome to another week of ReEngage. Thank you so much for joining me. And I realize typically what I do at the beginning of this is talk about some social distancing observations. And again, it's just taking over the country by storm, my observations. It's not. But anyway, I'm running out of observations. I'm kind of, getting a little ready to kind of get life going again a little bit. But I have noticed that one of the things that my wife and I have done around our house is there's this idea of influence, like you should really be influencing each other. And so it might be time for me to get out of the house a little bit more because I've started watching some more of my wife's shows, and that does include the Hallmark Channel. So anyway, just we'll stop right there. All right, so today I want to talk about expectations, and I think by defining what I mean about expectations will help you and your expectations about my expectations as we talk about expectations and we expect that. So anyway, here's how I define expectations. Expectations are attitudes and thoughts regarding the way things could be or should be. Let me say that again. Expectations are attitudes and thoughts regarding the way things could be or should be. Okay? And so all of us have expectations about marriage. And typically that comes from several sources. Family of origin, where we grew up, has a large part to do with that. So Doctors Les and Leslie Parrott say this: for most people, the biggest part of their context about how they understand the world is what they unconsciously learned about their role as a spouse from their family of origin. So some of our expectations we don't even don't have the ability to necessarily articulate. They're just kind of unconsciously given to us by the way we grew up. Okay, so that's a tough one to deal with, to know if we have those expectations. We get a lot of TV influence. Like I loved sitcoms when I was a kid, and so that kind of influenced how I thought marriage should be, just kind of happy-go-lucky all the time. The Hallmark Channel, as I'm watching that, might have some influence. Books, romance novels, movies, fairy tales. Even when it comes to sexuality, what we view, and maybe even pornography or different movies might have an influence on what we have in terms of expectations about how that should be done in our marriage. And so you and I, we have all kinds of expectations about what marriage or how it should be done. We have expectations about social obligations, family obligations, church involvement, community involvement, learning, finances. We have a lot of savers, a lot of spenders as I work with couples, how love should be expressed, sexuality, how we even communicate, entertainment needs, and how much money we spend on entertainment or don't, or what we do for entertainment. Raising children can be a huge expectation, especially in blended families. Household management, how we take care of the chores, who does the chores, all kinds of expectations. And so we have those expectations, and when those expectations or attitudes or thoughts go unmet, it can lead to some difficult thinking that goes on in our brains. My wife and I have had very different expectations when we got married. I felt the weekend was a time for us, starting Saturday morning at 10 a.m., take a little break on Sunday morning for church, but other than that, you're watching football until Monday night at 10 p.m. So Saturday morning till 10 a.m. She had expectations that the weekends were a time for us to go out and do things together and be outside and do adventurous type of things, and that was not a good thing. We also had very different expectations on taking care of the house. I kind of felt it was mainly her job, sorry to be so selfish, and she kind of felt it should be probably better, a more shared responsibility. So we had some frustrations there. But you can see where I'm going here. We all have these expectations. And when those expectations go unmet, it leads to typically negative emotions. And some of those negative emotions are disappointment, frustration. This is the way it should be. I think it could be this way. It leads to hurt. Maybe this person doesn't care about me because they're not doing these things. It leads to anger. And ultimately it leads to conflict. Okay, so expectations are a big deal because they influence so much of our thoughts about work and marriage and the world around us. And then when we have these expectations that come from even an unconscious spot and they go unmet, they lead to negative emotions, which typically leads to conflict. And so when we talked about conflict, we said that conflict is inevitable, and how we handle that is really kind of a big deal. And expectations are kind of similar to that, or in that regard. And so generally your expectations aren't right or wrong. Okay. They're just your expectations. However, the way you deal with the unmet expectations can have a lot to do with success in your marriage and marital oneness. And so expectations being unmet are kind of inevitable, but how we deal with that and how we process that can really say a lot about how our marriage goes. And so in James chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 in the Bible, and this is a really interesting book of the Bible because this is Jesus' brother that wrote this. And he says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And he says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? And then in verse 3, skip down, he says, when you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your own pleasures. And so James kind of identifies for us that fights and quarrels among us come from an internal battle, something that really is just selfishness, that we want what we want self-protection, self-preservation, whatever it would be, we take care of self. And so he says maybe another approach would be, instead of just losing it, that maybe we go to God, ask him to search our hearts for that selfishness so there can bring some healing there. And then we can actually deal with things a little bit better. But for all of us, he's really saying that the fights and the quarrels and when our expectations aren't met, it kicks into our selfishness. And that's really the problem, is our selfishness. So if you didn't realize this, and it took me a long time to realize this, you're selfish. So am I. Very selfish. Now I'm talking to me now. So when we look at selfishness and we look at kind of the battling worlds ethically, what's going on, one idea of selfishness is this idea of egocentrism. Egocentrism says this, that you think only of yourself without regard for the feeling or desires of others. You think only of yourself. What are my needs here? What do I want out of this? And the converse of that, the opposite of that, is altruism, is which you have this belief that you're concerned about the well-being of others. Typically, that's your first and foremost thought. So egocentrism, you can see the problem is about self. Altruism is thinking about other people. So the Bible, like I've said before, in James and other passages, have led me to believe that our central problem, kind of our sinful problem, our original sin problem, is that we're selfish. We have this idea of self as first and foremost, and protecting that's kind of in front of us, our number one agenda. And that's in front of us. And when it comes to expectations, we might be off then, because we're identifying then if egocentrism is our problem, that it probably generates a lot of where our expectations come from about marriage. So what we need to do then, if we realize that selfishness is probably driving it and not altruism, we're not really thinking about what are the expectations of this other person, we probably need to go back and do a little evaluation and say, hey, where can I align myself more with a biblical or a godly perspective? And so one of the things I'd encourage you to do is maybe even just start off with a list of expectations that you have. Don't evaluate, just write them down. And it could be things like, I expect him to take out the trash. I expect her to do the cooking. I expect him to initiate sex, or whatever it would be. And just start writing down these expectations and say, here's what's going on in my brain. Not evaluating whether they're egocentric or altruistic, just kind of identifying. Because one thing I've discovered about a lot of the problems that I have is identification is the first step. And we can identify, then also we can start to apply some better ways of doing those things. And so the next step might be to start to evaluate those expectations and see, are some of those unrealistic expectations that I have, that they would do this or this or this? Are some of them realistic? Are some of these expectations even uncommunicated? Like I have this expectation that my spouse is going to do this, but I've never said a word to them about that. So how in the world would they know that that's what I want them to do? And then some of them may be completely egocentric, where you're really thinking about yourself. And are there any expectations that are altruistic and you're thinking about them? And so maybe a good place to start would be to even think about your upcoming weekend. This is kind of where my wife and I started about communication and expectations, is to say, what are your plans for this weekend? My plan was to watch football from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m. 3 days in a row. Maybe your plan was to say, let's go out and shop for some new whatever, or just look around or go out and have coffee. But communicating those things, and then it helps us then to evaluate and come to a compromise situation where we understand what the other person is dealing with. Again, those communication expectations uncommunicated can lead to all kinds of frustration because we just can't read other people's minds. And so the other thing then that we have to do is, this is a hallmark thing of ReEngage, is we can't control other people. We can only control ourselves. And so we draw the circle around ourselves and we start to look at how you deal with unmet expectations. So how do you deal with those things? Evaluating yourself. If your expectations aren't met, how do you respond? Do you get all huffy and puffy? Is it very egocentric and you're thinking about yourself? And so maybe some things to think about in the future are, can I let things go when they don't go my way? Am I giving my spouse the benefit of the doubt that maybe they just had this idea and it wasn't to destroy my world, to destroy my weekend of watching football? Maybe it's just an idea. Another thing to do is just to kind of, even, I know this sounds a little crazy, but just even breathe and let the body know that, hey, this is not a big fight here. This is just me having to deal with expectations and evaluating myself. And the other thing that's kind of strange is oftentimes we think about our spouse not meeting our expectations, but this is weird, but do you realize you're probably a massive source for them of unmet expectations? And so even asking, not focusing on what they didn't do, but asking yourself this question, what are their expectations? And how could I hear those expectations? How could I honor those expectations? How could I serve them by thinking about their expectations a little bit more? How can I honor God by putting their expectations, altruism, above my expectations, egocentrism? And so again, generally your expectations about marriage, about life aren't necessarily right or wrong. Sometimes there's very egocentric things going on in there. But the way we deal with unmet expectations can have a lot to do with whether we experience oneness and peace within our marriage. And we can't control another human being, how they respond, but looking at our expectations and thinking, how can I begin to, in a kind way, maybe communicate some of my expectations? But maybe first and foremost to think, how could I be a little more altruistic and think about how can I meet their expectations? What's going on in their brain? Ask them questions about what they want to do. What are your plans for the weekend? What would you like to do? And ultimately, how can I honor God with those expectations? And so this is a big deal. Expectations is going to take a lot of work, but it's something for us to think about and even realize that there's some unconscious things going on. Try to get that thing out a little bit and realize that, man, I'm probably my spouse's source of unmet expectations, and what can I do to serve them a little bit better? And how could I be a little more altruistic with my expectations and their expectations instead of so egocentric with mine? Thank you, guys. Good luck with your expectations. I hope this is what you expected, but maybe we'll just stop there. Have a great week. Thanks, guys.